The topic of drinking on Purim and getting drunk is something that has been quite curious, perhaps even vexing to rabbinic scholars throughout the ages. And that's something we're going to be speaking specifically about the 18th and 19th century rabbis on exactly this topic in the 127th episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. Welcome, everybody. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm very excited to welcome fourth-time guest of the show, Rabbi David Fried. Rabbi Fried, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be back here.
For those less familiar with Rabbi Fried, he teaches Judaic Studies at the upper school, the Ramaz school. He is also an editor and frequent contributor at the Lehrhaus. He lives in New Jersey with his wife, Molly, and their two sons, Elchanan and Saadia. He earned his rabbinic ordination from my alma mater, YCT Rabbinical School. Rabbi Fried, welcome back again.
Thank you. Pleasure to be back.
Absolutely. And so for those, one thing I did not mention in the biography, and listeners, if you haven't checked this out, he has been here to speak about this topic twice previously. We first started digging into this on episode number 61 when we discussed the Rishonim, the medieval Jewish rabbinic authorities on this topic. And then following that up, in episode number 94 on early Aharonim, sort of early modern, I guess, period. And that's really the 16th and 17th century rabbis on this topic. And now progressing on 18th and 19th century rabbinic figures on the topic of Purim drinking. So we've built up a nice, every year, some momentum and certainly a chronological progression. And so we've reached 18th, 19th century. Now, where we left off, Rabbi Fried, and certainly for listeners, we had discussed Rabbi Elijah Spira, something he wrote in his Great Elijah, his Elia Rabbah, and something that we had discussed was specifically, he wrote about some sort of song, and also that it's very careful, that one should be very careful not to get really, how would you describe Kalut Rosh? So sort of not taking things seriously.
Frivolity,
yep, in a very frivolous state of mind, just to be happy. And also, he says that one should be very careful about certain ritual activities when it comes to certainly around eating, mealtime. So that's the last. But one thing we hadn't picked up, and this is a book, actually, it's very appropriate, even though he passes away early on in the 18th century, his book actually doesn't get published until his brother does so mid 18th century. And there's a fascinating new thing that really appears on the scene that Rabbi Fried, you and I have not really discussed before, because it hasn't really come up, Shulchan Aruch, before, what to drink.
But it comes up, and it comes up here not because he's discussing what to drink per se, but by way of finally asking the why question. Why does this law of drinking in Purim, which may or may not exist as we discussed previously, but if it exists, why does it exist? And from the reason for it, you can start discussing, well, does that apply just to wine? Does it include other beverages as well? But what really is novel in the 18th century is finally 1,500 years after the Gemara said it, someone stops and asks why. Everything we've discussed up till this point has either been, do we rule like that opinion in the Gemara? And assuming we do, how much is Adolayada? What exactly is the shear of how much you're supposed to drink if you're supposed to drink? Mm-hmm. But no one stopped to ask why until the 18th century or until the late 17th century with the Elia Rabbah.
It's actually deeply fascinating. Rava, it certainly doesn't mention in the Talmud specifically why. Clearly, it's in the background. Anybody who reads the biblical book of Esther, drinking is all over the place. Mishta this, yayin that. It's all over.
Right, which is exactly what the Elia Rabbah says here.
Yeah.
But it's amazing that it took 1,500 years for anyone to make that connection and to say, he says, well, the reason that we have this mitzvah to drink on Purim is because the whole miracle happened through wine, through all these feasts of wine that we read about in the Megillah, and commemorating those feasts of wine. That's why we have this mitzvah of drinking on Purim. And sort of incidentally from that, as you said, we can infer that it's really about the wine, and so it wouldn't be appropriate to start drinking other beverages if you think this is the right reason.
Well, actually, Mike, I wouldn't say that it took all this long for this to happen. I think even Rava and the other sages in the Talmud were keenly aware of this. I think he's the first rabbi to really explicitly articulate this connection.
I guess you could assume it was lurking in the background,
Yes.
and everyone knew it. I'm honestly not so sure. Like, I'm not so sure the Eli Rabbi is right in what he says about this. Like, why? Like,
so you're saying because of all the drinking parties,
like,
and therefore,
why would we want to imitate the thing that was the downfall of our enemies in the Megillah? But that said, as we'll see, even though nobody said this, or at least nobody articulated it explicitly until
actually,
late 17th, early 18th century, and then once he says this, it just starts spreading like wildfire. This becomes like the standard explanation, at least in non-Hasidic circles. We'll talk about the Hasidic explanation later.
Yeah. Well, so this is actually fascinating. I realize not all of our listeners or viewers can read the Hebrew here, but he actually starts out with a question. He says, how can you say, since our sages have said that there are in many different places, and this is really parroting what Rabbi Cairo writes in his Beit Yosef, he quotes someone else, but that drunkenness is a great stumbling block. And you're supposed to, maybe you should avoid this. How could anybody obligate someone to do this? Certainly not our Talmudic sages. So maybe there's something good. So it sounds really actually, this is a response to make this explicit articulation about the connection with the book of Esther. That really gives good ground to stand on as to, he's really trying to support the Talmud here.
Yeah.
Right. So I think he said he's trying to balance it. Drunkenness can be a problem, but there's got to be a good wisdom in it, and it is going back to the all the drinking parties in the book of Esther that somehow we're trying to commemorate it, I guess, even though the downfall was through drinking wine.
Like I said, that is what he says. Like I said, it always struck me as odd that we'd be commemorating the thing that was the downfall of our enemies. Unless there's, there's like, it's like a tikkun. It's like. Mm-hmm. They used it for they use wine for bad. We're going to show we could use it for good, something like that. But that's not what he says, though. I can imagine someone saying something like that.
He does also mention at the end. He says it's written in response of Maharil that you need to get drunk, but it's for a mitzvah, but it's not. Doesn't hold one back. It's not a sine qua non. It's not an absolute necessity.
Right. I mean, that's not his main point here, nor is it original, as you said. He's quoting the Maharil. Right. But yes, that and we'll see some of the later Aharonim discussing like what does that mean. But
it pops back up later on.
It pops back up later on. But so he is of the opinion that
we're foreshadowing
that Adalayada is a lechatchila. It's the ideal way to do it, but it's not like you haven't fulfilled your mitzvah to drink if you don't reach Adalayada, whatever that is.
He really kicks off our journey into 18th and ultimately 19th century rabbis on this topic. And actually, it's not to do more foreshadowing, but it really colors a lot of what we're going to read. Right?
Yes. Although, as we'll see, not
Spoiler
because
alert.
of him, because nobody studied the Eliyah Rabbah. Not nobody. Talmidei Chachamim studied the Eliyah Rabbah, but it wasn't a popular work the way some of these other works we're going to look at are. Mm-hmm. And
he was not as influential.
Right. Where, when we look at the Chayei Adam, for instance, like the Chayei Adam was a practical halacha guidebook. Anyone who could read in Lithuania had a copy of the Chayei Adam in their house.
Yeah.
So,
okay. So as we're moving on, there's Rabbi Elazar Rokeach's Maaseh Rokeach. That was.
I'll hold off on the Chayei Adam.
Yeah. No, it's a good tease. It's a really good tease. And something he says is something that we've seen in the early Aharonim, something we discussed in episode 94. He ultimately just says, just drink a little bit more than you're used to. This is just right?
Yeah, he's not really, he's just picking among the opinions we've seen previously. He's not really adding anything novel here.
Yeah. It's nice to continue to see certain trends that the rabbis continue to write about. So he writes about this thing. He says, it's a mitzvah alma, but alma, it's a common thing. It's not something you necessarily have to do, like we just read previously. And also that shishta yota milimudo, l'shem asiyas mitzvah. Okay, you should just drink more than you're used to drinking.
Yeah.
Nothing earth shattering, but certainly significant. And then we next get to Rabbi Joseph ben Meir Ta'omim, his Pri Megadim. That's something that gets published in the mid 18th century, which is ultimately to be careful. And ultimately, maybe just don't get so drunk.
Right. So he has two main points, which certainly are points that get picked up by the 19th century Aharonim. One is this idea, which is sort of expanding on what the Rabbi said. The Rabbi said, be careful that you don't miss out on any mitzvot like Netilat Yadayim or Birkat Hamazon because you're too drunk or whatever. And he sort of goes a step beyond that and says, we're not just concerned that you won't do the physical actions of these mitzvot. We're even concerned that you won't have the right kavanah for these mitzvot. We rule mitzvot through kavanah, and you have to make sure you do all of these mitzvot with the right kavanah. And if the drunkenness is at all going to detract not from your ability to do the actions, but from your ability to have the kavanah for these mitzvot, shouldn't get drunk. And then he ultimately, his second point is he endorses practically the, like you said, the k'tzat yoter milimudo, have a little bit more than usual, take a nap following, the Ramaz, whom we discussed last year. And that's how you can fulfill this, and that's the best way to do this. Stay away from drinking.
Well, so that was the previous one. He actually says that here in the Purim-Drinking, he doesn't say just drink a little bit more than you're used to. He says two different things. He says about the getting drunk, but then the latter part he says, you know what? You don't need to get so drunk. Just drink a little bit. I don't know. That's not exactly the same formulation of drinking more than you're used to, but he does go into drink a bit, sleep. And then that's how you don't know.
But his comment is on the line in the Ramaz when the Ramaz says that. So I have to assume it means the same thing.
Fair. It's interesting. I think quite differently than what we read in Elia Rabbah, who talks about you're going to be eating, right? You're going to be doing your drinking while you're eating. So you have to be careful with your hand washing, your Birkat Hamazon, your blessings. That's all meal focused. He actually expands it not only to those things, which he talks about, but also the other mitzvahs of the day, such as matanot le'evyonim and mishloach manot. So it's interesting because Elia Rabbah, I guess there's an assumption you already did those mitzvot before you approach your seudah. Here, it's not necessarily a given.
Yeah, and again, and he's not right, and it's not so much he's concerned that God forbid you wouldn't do these things, just that. Of course, if an ani comes, I'm going to give them money, but I have to make sure I have kavanah that is for the mitzvah of matanot le'evyonim, and that I might not be able to have if I'm too drunk.
Have we discussed kavanah before in the early Aharonim?
No.
This feels a little bit new. Yeah, this is a new angle. It's a new addition to the conversation about the necessity for intentionality. I don't know how much of where he's directing the directing. I mean, he does say about all these other mitzvot, Netilat Yadayim, Birkat Hamazon, the matanot, all these different things. He says those need kavanah. I guess you're not going to do that when you're drinking. Is he also drinking the kavanah towards the drinking, or just all the other things?
I mean,
because he does say,
Purim umatanot le'evyonim mishloach manot yesh lo martzarech kavanah. Right, so he includes Sudat Purim. So, right, you have to, when you're eating, and presumably when you're drinking, it's part of the Suda, you have to be able to have in mind that I'm drinking this for the mitzvah of Sudat Purim. And if you're too drunk to be able to do that, then you need to stop drinking.
Well, the next line is really fascinating. He says, Yesh lomar su'uda ikar, the meal's the central point, l'zechar nes, to remember the miracle, shnasei al yidei su'uda, that happened during all the drinking parties. Al kain ba'i kavanah v'tzarech iyun. So now he comes to a question point. Wait, so maybe the drinking requires intentionality.
Right. He's taking, and he quotes the Elia Rabbah, and that's his first thing. He says, I in Elia Rabbah. So it's not like
okay, fair.
He understands he didn't come up with this entirely on his own, but he takes it to a new level.
Right. He's developing Elia Rabbah.
Yeah. The Shari Tshuva it's not what the Shari Tshuva says, it's who he's quoting. So
he mentions the
quoting Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who the Sidur Amudei Shemayim, that's Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who's quoting his father, the Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi.
That's really going back.
Yeah. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden is in our time period. His father, maybe not so much. Who just saying that his father in his youth would try and be Mekayim Ad Yada Kipshuta.
Literally.
Of course, we've seen lots of different opinions what pshat in Ad Yada is, but presumably that's a lot of alcohol. And then as he got older, alcohol started making him sick and he stopped doing it.
Well, it's also interesting that it was when he was young, he really strived to do it to the most maximally literal point. But then that was a bit much.
Right. And he adds this point, he even has a proof from the Gemara that if it's going to make you sick, you don't need to do it.
Right.
It talks about, there's a story in the Yerushalmi that alcohol would give him this terrible headache, and so the only time he would drink during the year was the 4 cups of wine on Pesach. And so he says, you see that Pesach is the only time that you need to drink if it's going to make you sick, implying Purim, if it's going to make you sick, you don't.
It's nice to have that out, right? That sort of off ramp that you don't need to drink Purim really all that much, or at least not wine. With Purim just days away, if you want to check out Purim resources and more, we've got that. If you just simply go to jewishdrinking.com/Purim. Feel free to check it out. All right, thank you, and I'm wishing you a freiliche Purim, a very happy Purim. L'chaim. So now we get to Chai Adam. This is we had a whole episode here on the Jewish Drinking Show about Chai Adam and drinking in this particular book. So drinking exists. Rabbi Danzig knows about whiskey. He talks about it a lot in his book and other drinking opportunities. This book was published in 1810.
He doesn't really say anything original. He's basically just quoting the Eliyah Rabbah. He quotes this idea about, where it's, we drink wine because it's symbolic of, the wine in the Megillah, and, that the miracle happened with, and then he quotes the idea of, don't drink to the point where you're gonna neglect mitzvot like Netilat Yadayim or Birkat Hamazon, or if you're gonna, be
he
too
expands
drunk
it more.
Mincha or Mariv after that night.
He's doing more expansion.
He's showing the Eliyah Rabbah as well.
Well, he's expanding from what we saw before of the previous Aharonim, right? So pre-Megadim, he talked about, be careful also about Matana Evyonim and Mishloach Manot. Be careful about those other things.
I mean, I don't know that
now he's adding.
Has seen the pre-Megadim, they're contemporaries.
Okay, fine. They're both adding on to the Eliyah Rabbah. Eliyah Rabbah was really focused just on matters of the meal. The Inyane Su'udah, he talked about be careful with Netilat Yadayim, Birkat Hamazon. Those you should be careful about. He really, right here, Rabbi Danzig really adds on.
Well, so he adds tefillah onto it. He adds the point that you're not, if you're drunk, you're not allowed to daven. If you're so drunk, you may not even be Yotze B'di'eved. And he says if you're going to wind up missing Mincha or Mariv, then for sure, don't drink so much that you're going to not be able to daven Mincha or Mariv. So yes, he adds on that.
He says, "Mutav shel ishtaker." Better you shouldn't get drunk.
Yeah,
and he adds on, "V'chol ma'asav yeheh l'shem shemayim." Everything should be for the sake of heaven.
I'm not sure he means by that the same thing as the Pri Megadim did.
Interesting. Okay.
I don't think he's talking about you need kavana in each of these mitzvot. I think that's going back on the drinking, saying make sure that you drink in a way that is not going to keep you from doing mitzvot, because that would be drinking low l'shem shemayim. You need to drink in a way that's only l'shem shemayim.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I like that. But he doesn't necessarily. Otherwise, he doesn't talk about kavanah. That's not his introduction.
I don't think he's talking about kavanah. I think that's the Pri Megadim's thing.
Yeah, but he does. One thing he does bring in, mentioning Eliyah Rabbah, is the notion about the story, the connecting with the story, and that's why we're drinking. Also, he really singles out wine, and because we have done an episode here on the Jewish Drinking Show about Chai Adam, and very aware of whiskey. It's fascinating that he really singles out and valorizes wine, almost to the exclusion of whiskey or any other beverage. This reason
only applies to wine. It's not about the intoxication. It's not about the drunkenness. It's about commemorating the miracle that happened through wine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that word, commemorating.
Yeah.
Well, so Eliyah Rabbah mentions wine. Maaseh Rokeach a little bit to some degree. Really here, this is a very clear articulation of the privileging, the preferencing of wine for this getting drunk on Purim.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not sure he does it more than the Eliyah Rabbah does. I think he's more or less quoting the Eliyah Rabbah on that point.
Right. But so I don't know how widespread whiskey was by the time of Eliyah Rabbah. I know for our earlier Jewish drinking show episode on the Chai Adam, he's very clearly
aware. Around the time of the Bach already, right?
Right. So, but he's very clearly it's not ambiguous. It's unambiguous.
Right.
He is privileging wine.
The Rabbi gives it as a tamei mitzvot, but doesn't necessarily focus on the practical consequence of that. And maybe the Chai Adam emphasizes more the practical consequence because other drinks were more available, and he had to focus on that.
Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah. I realize at this point, I'm just going to throw in a note for our listeners because I know I'm going to get some emails about all this wine stuff, which is that, yes, Rambam in his Mishnah Torah does talk about drinking wine. I know that. I hear that. At the same time, I think Rambam's really just talking about wine as that's your drink. I mean, he's also writing in an area where I don't know if they have that much beer, but he definitely has wine. So I really think that Rambam really just writes it as a metonym for all alcoholic beverages. Here it really comes across as it's singling out and excluding all other beverages with privileging wine specifically.
Like you said, I mean, I don't know if it's a metonym for all other beverages, because if that was the alcoholic beverage the Rambam knew about, I don't know what the Rambam would have said if you told him, hey, there's another alcoholic beverage. He'd have to think about that question. I don't know if he ever thought about it.
I mean, he's in Egypt, so really beer is what you drink in Egypt. But then again, he's also living in Muslim Egypt, so that's a whole other.
The Muslims, they shouldn't be drinking. I mean, that doesn't mean they didn't, but they shouldn't be drinking.
It's just harder to all alcoholic beverages are going to be harder to come by in early medieval Muslim Egypt. It's just a reality. When Rabbi Danzig is writing in the 19th/late 18th century, they have whiskey, they have wine, they have these, and I don't know for him how the financial aspects are, because I know an earlier rabbi we discussed, Rabbi David Levi, who wrote the Taz. In his time, wine was pretty expensive, so people normally just drank beer. So this is a side comment. I'm just going to make it anyways. When it comes to Shabbat, okay, normal Shabbats, he talks about everybody makes Kiddush Friday night on wine, but when it comes to Shabbat day, the Kiddusha Rabbah, the great Kiddush, that only the wealthy people made Kiddush on wine. Everybody else made it on beer. That's how it was in his day. So again, that was before that you'd have to, it's a little bit earlier. Maybe things changed by the time of Rabbi Danzig, but there's something privileging, something special about wine going on for him.
In general, like you said, wine seems to be the beverage of choice for ritual purposes, right? You perhaps, if wine is too expensive, you can make daytime Kiddush on beer. It's Chamar Medina, but even what we call that, it's Chamar Medina. It's the wine of this locale.
Right.
It's, right. It's there, and it makes sense, even without the whole reason about commemorating the wine in the Megillah, it makes sense that if you're thinking of this as a ritual drinking, a la Kiddush and Havdalah or Pesach or, whatever it is, it makes sense that your first choice of beverage is going to be wine. Maybe not your only choice, but it makes sense that that's your sort of default go-to.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far with Rabbi Fried. I'm going to break in and give you a sneak peek into next week's episode, which will be publishing the day after Purim.
For our kosher for Passover rum, we work with a couple of different groups to create barrel picks.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek, and now back into this episode with Rabbi Fried. Now moving on a little bit later. So this is the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, sort of the abbreviated set table. Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried, who published his work in 1864. And ultimately, he does a lot of quoting the Eliyah Rabbah, since the entire miracle.
I mean, probably quoting the Chai Adam, again, because as I said, the Chai Adam was a much more popularly studied work than the Eliyah Rabbah. Now, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch surely knew the Eliyah Rabbah, so you can maybe think both of them.
Right.
But
the notion about, as I like your word, commemorating the moment, the experiences of Esther through all the wine drinking. But ultimately he comes down and says, just drink more than you usually do and sleep. Yeah.
But again, and the Chai, I can't emphasize enough, the Chai Adam and the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, like these were the two popularizers. If you weren't a scholar, nobody studied the Eliyah Rabbah, but the Chai Adam was like the standard practical halacha guidebook that Lithuanian Jews had, and the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch was like the standard practical halacha guidebook that Hungarian Jews had. And from the fact that the two of them, grab onto these ideas, even if they originated with the Eliyah Rabbah, they're really the popularizers of it. And that's why these positions sort of become the default understandings, the default positions throughout, at least Lithuanian and Hungarian Jewry.
Wow. That's very, they're rabbinic influencers. I mean, that's very influential. It's sort of these twin pillars of Chai Adam Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and even to this day, I mean, it's they're easy, as opposed to something. Spoiler alert: the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Berurah or Aruch HaShulchan, which are multi-volume works, they're lengthy. These are, you can just use them as a handbook. You can easily tote them around.
They were written for,
right?
Unlike the Mishnah Berurah and the Aruch HaShulchan to a lesser degree, but even the Aruch HaShulchan they're works that are written for scholars.
Yeah.
The Aruch HaShulchan maybe was written for community rabbis, but it wasn't written for Balabatim.
Right. These you can more easily get into people's houses.
Right. These were written to be works that every person could have in their house, or at least every literate person could have in their house.
Yeah.
The Eliyah Rabbah was a commentary on the Levush. Right?
Okay,
so you not only had to be like a scholar, you had to be to the point where you're studying Levush.
Yeah.
to notice that there's something that the Eliyah Rabbah said something.
That's fair. But yeah. So a lot of nothing crazy here. Although he does talk about what if they're sick. Mishahu chalush b'tiv o. Okay, so if you're a little bit sick,
sort of quoting the Shari Tshuva, right? He's quoting everyone we've seen previously, which is usually what he does. There's not too many chidushim in Kitzur Shulchan Aruch.
Yeah,
he has, which not to denigrate the person, like he's fully capable of chidushim. He has other works where he has chidushim. Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is just not that.
Yeah. No, it's just nice to be able to trace back who he's referencing and where that's coming from. And ultimately he quotes, who is this? He says Mutav Shali Shtaker B'chol Ma'asev Yehu L'Shem Shamayim. That is a direct quote.
That was Chai Adam.
That's Chai Adam. Oh, so he's directly quoting. It's better you shouldn't get drunk, So ultimately, maybe don't necessarily get so drunk. Oh, he talks about bivracha or bitfilah, right? Your blessings, your prayers.
Chai Adam.
Okay. Did he get it from Chai? Did he? I guess he read it, right? It was
yeah.
I was going to say it was published a half century before he published this work.
A lot of Kitzur Shulchan Aruch.
Okay. Okay. So he published it a half century later, and he seems to be directly quoting. All right. So similar concepts here going on. Just drink more than normal. You don't really need to get drunk. Your action should be for heaven. All your prayers, blessings, etc. I wanted to break in really briefly. I'm Rabbi Drew, your host and founder of JewishDrinking.com. Turns out, as of this fall, the IRS has recognized Jewish Drinking as a 501c3 organization. You are always welcome to make donations. If you have any questions how to do so, you can check out the website or even simply email me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you. Now back into the show.
The Mishnah Berurah doesn't really add any analysis. The Mishnah Berurah quotes the Chai Adam and he quotes the Pri Megadim, and that's about it.
So Mishnah Berurah and also Biur Halacha, these twin works by Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan, like me, a fellow Kohen, and so he passed away much later. But this work, or at least this sixth chelik of Mishnah Berurah, was published in 1907. And the Mishnah Berurah isn't even as interesting as the Biur Halacha for this.
Yeah, I mean, in the Mishnah Berurah he quotes the Pri Megadim, and in the Biur Halacha he quotes the Chai Adam. Like none of this is original. Right.
None of it's original, and yet what's intensely fascinating, at least to me, hopefully others think this as well, is what's being articulated, what's being, and certainly the influence of both of these works. Just as we talked about these earlier 19th century works of both Chai Adam and Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, is also the enduring 20th century influence of both of these works, of both Mishnah Berurah and Aruch HaShulchan.
The Mishnah Berurah, as I guess Chaim Soloveitchik wrote about, doesn't really become people don't really start using it as a practical halacha work until post-World War II. But certainly today...
Is that a rupture and reconstruction comment?
In rupture and reconstruction, okay. Yeah, he talks about that. But certainly today, with the Chai Adam and the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch were the reason why those views became so popular throughout Europe, definitely the reason why it maintains popularity in in the yeshivish world today is because of the influence of the Mishnah Berurah. And so again, whether he intended his work to be for that purpose or not, it's a work that has had just tremendous influence. And so you see sort of another vector, another conduit in the spreading of these ideas. It starts, as we said, with the Eliyah Rabbah, who, is this, commentary hidden on the Levush, which is a work that, again, only scholars study to begin with. And then there's a commentary on the Levush. So really only like the top scholars would have seen the Eliyah Rabbah, but then it gets picked up by the Chayei Adam, it gets picked up by the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and it gets picked up, and the same ideas get picked up by the Mishnah Berurah and really spread it, throughout the Torah learning world. His practical conclusion ultimately is like the Pri Megadim. He says, have a little bit more than usual, go to sleep, right? That's, which we saw really starts with the Ramah, although the Ramah quotes two opinions and says, Echad Hamar Bev, Echad Hamar Hamamid El Yichavin Libo El Shemayim. So the Ramah doesn't explicitly choose between the two opinions, but you see the Pri Megadim clearly favoring the drink a little bit more than usual and go to sleep, and the Mishnah Berurah explicitly endorsing that approach as well.
It's funny because this first Biur Halacha we have here is very Eliyah Rabbah-esque, and then the latter one is more Chayei Adam-esque.
Yeah,
but also he specifies the wine.
Halacha, right, he quotes the whole bit about how the miracle happened through wine.
Right. So it's the valorizing of the wine aspect for the day as opposed to other beverages, and also drink more. You mentioned drink more than normal, then sleep, and then also be careful about the practices. So,
right, again, and right, quoting both the Chayei Adam and the Pri Megadim, and both the be careful that you wash and bench and and you're able to daven, and he quotes the Pri Megadim with the Kavana aspect also. He just sort of brings it all together.
Yeah.
Anything that's a reason to limit drinking on Purim, he seems to be in favor of.
Very true. Very true.
Although, he does not go so far as to, go back to the Rishonim and endorse Rabbi Fried. And I guess, that's hard to do because the Shulchan Aruch didn't. But as much as he can limit the Shulchan Aruch's position, he seems to want to go there.
I'm going to pull on that thread. You mentioned Shulchan Aruch. And you know who else mentioned Shulchan Aruch?
Aruch Shulchan.
That's right. So ultimately, he goes through this whole conversation with himself, this and that. Ultimately, he says, look, Rabbi Cairo, Yosef Cairo, who we discussed in a previous discussion on this in episode 94, he says the same authoritative Rabbi Yosef Cairo writes in two separate works. He says, on one hand, in his Joseph's house, Beit Yosef, that it can be an issue. There are so many different problems that come about through drunkenness. Maybe we should stay away from it. Alternatively, in his set table, Shulchan Aruch, he writes, it's a direct quote from Rava in the Babylonian Talmud. Just get drunk until you can no longer differentiate or otherwise distinguish between Rava, between Mordechai.
And we noted this in our last episode when we were discussing Rabbi Yosef Cairo, that in the Beit Yosef, he seems to quote everyone who, he quotes all of the Rishonim who passing like Rabbi Fried that we don't really hold Adol Yada, and he certainly seems like he's going in that direction. And then you open up Shulchan Aruch and he just quotes Adol Yada. We don't really have an explanation like this. He changed his mind. What happened?
Right. And so ultimately he closes and he just says Tzarachin. This requires further inquiry.
And the Aruch HaShulchan really makes note of that, and he says, I don't understand what happened to all the Rabbeinu Ephraim that. So, and the Aruch HaShulchan seems to be the only one of the later Aharonim who is willing to go back and bring back Rabbeinu Ephraim and say, maybe we just don't pass him like this whole other thing at all.
That is a really fascinating note. Bringing back Rabbeinu Ephraim.
Everyone else, they come to the same conclusion. At the end of the day, the Mishnah Berurah and the Aruch HaShulchan come to the same conclusion. They both, at the end of the day, endorse the position of don't get drunk, drink a little bit more than you're used to, go to sleep. But they come there from very different angles. The Mishnah Berurah quoting exclusively Aharonim, right? The Pri Megadim, the Chayei Adam. He quotes the Taz in there also, but exclusively Aharonim, not challenging the Shulchan Aruch psak of Adol Yada, but finding any Aharon he can who's going to limit what that means. Whereas the Aruch HaShulchan, sort of typical of the Aruch HaShulchan, takes us through the sugya from the beginning, reanalyzes, everything starting with the Rishonim and, ultimately comes to the same conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I found ultimately really fascinating, despite all the ink he spilled, was what he writes parenthetically after this, which he says, maybe it can be explained, ad v'lo ad bichlal, go up to that point of drunkenness, but not including that. And then he says, umase, practically, maybe you should distance yourself from drunkenness, and specifically whiskey. This whole whiskey drinking bit. He says, you know what? By whiskey drunkenness, you're gonna be vomiting. It ends. There's no good ending to whiskey drinking on Purim. And he says, you know what? And he basically says, "Lishtot ma'at yoter milimudov lishon katzat." You know what? Just drink more than you're used to and sleep a little bit. Take a nap. Which is fascinating because we haven't seen any of these other rabbis specifying whiskey, even though it's on the periphery, like Chayadim, Rabbi Danzig. He says, you know what? Let's really favor wine. He's saying, you know what? Let's stay away from whiskey.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, like you said, his practical conclusion is in a parenthetical comment at the end.
After everything else he writes, multi-paragraph.
And his analysis is somewhat inconclusive. And so he's got to tell you, okay, even though my analysis might be inconclusive, here's what I really think you should do.
Parenthetically.
And I think, like, his first point, he expresses astonishment at the Ramaz read of the Rambam.
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah.
That is the connecting thread throughout everything he writes here, is bafflement. He is utterly baffled, this point, that point, and that's his conclusion. He's baffled with Rabbi Cairo, and ultimately his answer is parenthetically commented. But it's just bafflement all throughout.
Right. He's baffled with everyone. So he starts off his discussion with his bafflement at the Ramah. Right. Mm-hmm. So the Ramah understood. The Rambam said, drink ad sheyishtaker v'yeradim b'shechruto, which, as we said in our previous episodes, doesn't sound to us like what the Ramah is saying, but that's not for the reason the Aruch HaShulchan is going to say. Right? It sounds to me like the Rambam is saying, get so drunk that you pass out.
Yeah.
Which which is not how the Ramah understands him. The Ramah understands him to, it just means drink a little and go to sleep, and by going to sleep, you fulfill this idea of Adla Yada. The Aruch HaShulchan says, if the Gemara meant go to sleep, the Gemara knew how to say go to sleep. Adla Yada does not mean go to sleep.
They know how to talk about sleeping in the Gemara.
Yes. It says the only way to understand the Rambam is the Rambam reads the Gemara like Rabbi David Fried. The Rambam thinks we don't paskin Adla Yada, and that's why he didn't mention Adla Yada. And I don't know where he came up with this sleep thing, but it's got nothing to do with Adla Yada.
Okay.
And it's very interesting that after, he says, I don't know why the Ramah interpreted the Rambam that way. I don't know where the Rambam got this from. And then at the end of the day, in his parenthetical comments, he says, yeah, but that's the opinion you should follow.
Yeah.
So there's that. And then along the way, so he quotes the Rav Yah, who we saw quoted in the Meiser, and the Maril, who we saw quoted in the Meiser Rokeach earlier, about la mitzvah v'lo li'ikuv. And he said, I don't understand that either, right? More bafflement.
Yeah.
Right? It says, what do you mean lo li'ikuva? The Gemara uses the word chayiv.
Chayiv. Right.
Chayiv doesn't mean le mitzvah. The Gemara could have used the word mitzvah if it was le mitzvah. And then he tries to defend. He tries to defend that position. He says, maybe chayav is going on livasume. It's not going on adla yada. You're chayav to drink. And la mitzvah adla yada. And maybe
acrobatics.
Split up the Gemara that way to defend that position. And says, but then he says, maybe it's not even la mitzvah. Maybe it's just la reshus. Maybe adla yada just means you're allowed to drink that much. Because any other time of year you wouldn't even be allowed. And it's not even telling you it's a mitzvah. And then he quotes, not quotes. Then he, like you said, maybe ad de lo yada is lo ad bichlal. You're
up to, but not inclusive.
Not to that point. Close to that point, but not to that point, which I don't think anyone has said that explicitly before him. I think that's his hitch. After all that bafflement, at the end of the day, he says, just follow the Ramah.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying the show. I want to break in. If you are enjoying this content, if you enjoy the show, if you enjoy other content I publish here with whether the Jewish Drinking Show or jewishdrinking.com, it's not just a website. It's not just the internet. I also exist in real life. I've spoken here in Southwest Ohio, as well as just the other month out of town in a couple different places, both Midwest, East Coast. I'm happy to actually bring Jewish drinking content to you, whether JCC, synagogue, Jewish organization. You don't even have to be a Jewish organization. You want to pay me? You want to have me bring insightful and lively content your way? Happy to do so. You can feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com, and we can see how we can bring Lehrhaus to life. All right, now back into the show. Rabbi Fried, and you also pointed out, I mean, we've been discussing all these non-Hasidic rabbis,
Yes.
but there is a Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. He publishes a 1798, right on the cusp of our 18th and 19th century works. What say you?
So this is right. So another, as we said in the beginning, the 18th century and late 17th century is really where people first start asking why about this.
Mm-hmm.
And, we traced the spread of one of the answers to that question, but the Hasidic world also asked why. And so in a sense, this is going to be of a piece with that, but gave a totally different answer to the why question. And, I found here in the Kedushat Levi, he says it very clearly, very, very nicely. I don't know if it's his original idea because I found versions of this idea all through different Hasidic sources. I'm really not sure who had it first. But the basic idea is that we want to Adla Yada Bain Arur Haman Levarach Mordechai is we want to get to a place of realizing that there is no Arur and there is no Baruch, where all is this sort of mystical unity. We realize realizing that anything that happened, it's not because Haman was bad and it's not because Mordechai was good. It's just all the Ratzon Haborei. And that sort of fits in with the idea of Purim as the holiday where the Megillah, where we don't mention God's name, where God is hidden, where it's not that we see God acting through a specific miraculous act, but it's all about getting to a place where we could appreciate God in everything. And the use of alcohol, and here it really is about the alcohol and the intoxication and not the wine specifically. It's not about commemorating the wine in the Megillah. That that place of intoxication, which obviously can be a place where people can do terrible things and terrible Chil Hashems, and he mentions that as well. But it also can be a place where you get to this appreciation of not trying to analyze differences so much, and the breaking down of boundaries, and the appreciation of this the cosmic mystical unity.
I'm clearly misnagdish, so I'm listening.
Yeah, I mean, I'm misnagid too, but
I mean, it feels very meta. We're too misnagdim, whatever. It's fine. It's great.
I sort of, I guess I have a misnagdish appreciation for the lumdus of mysticism.
Oh, okay, that's good. It's that's beautiful.
That's not something I do myself, but it's interesting to read about.
Yeah.
And I think,
it's
sort of
actually, can I just go meta? I'm not going to discuss what he says. I mean, it's really fascinating to consider everything we've discussed before. The Rishon in the medieval period and 15th and 16th, 17th century rabbis talking about Purim-Drinking. When it comes to 18th and 19th century, guess who pops up onto the scene? We get the Hasidic movement. This is a real novel aspect going on historically, certainly for Jewish history, certainly for rabbinic Jewish history. It's going to be a very different approach to these matters.
Yeah.
So that's a novelty on the scene.
For sure. And, I'm sure someone else who knows a lot more about it than me could speak about the sociological role of alcohol in the Hasidic movement. But I mean, it's definitely the idea of using alcohol to appreciate a certain mystical unity, that like it makes sense to me. I mean, William James, Variety of Religious Experience, writes that, he already writes about like the similarities between religious experience and drunkenness.
Interesting.
And
ecstasy, I guess. Yeah. Interesting.
Right. That,
it's a different form of level of consciousness, right?
Yeah. And, getting that, they act, and he didn't have the neuroscience, but, this research continues to this day that, that like certain substances like alcohol, like certain psychedelic substances, activate similar parts of the brain through religious experiences. Like peyote in certain Native American religions being used as part of religious ceremonies. And it seems to be a similar thing that the Chassidim are doing here, which is using that substance to sort of bring on that religious experience. And again, there's still this caution, like make sure you do it in a way that it's going to be a religious experience and not just a hedonistic one, but being willing to use, help from alcohol to bring on a certain mysticism of the masses that, most people aren't able to get mystical experiences, just on their own. It takes a lot of preparation. Even then, sometimes you never get it. But sort of Hasidim who wanted to sort of popularize mysticism for the masses, being more willing to, accept the role of alcohol and the risks of alcohol as part of that process.
Rabbi Fried, this has been fascinating. This has been a wonderful text study in Jewish practice. Before we go, is there anything you would like to promote?
Check out the Lehrhaus.com. So
great
place for text-based discourse in the Orthodox world and beyond.
That's wonderful. I actually just read an essay today. So awesome. Thank you so much, Rabbi Fried. This has been fantastic. This has been great. This has been exciting. This has been wonderful. And with that, I want to wish everybody l'chaim, and you l'chaim.